In World War II, the most devastating conventional bombing campaign in human history was just completely unleashed on Japan.
Yeah, it was really unprecedented. Just methodical destruction from the air.
Right. Cities were quite literally turned to ash. I mean, the firebombing campaigns created these massive, self-sustaining firestorms that just consumed entire urban districts.
It's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of it.
Exactly. And yet, well, when you dig into the historical data and you look at the absenteeism rate for Japanese factory workers in 1945...
Which was the absolute height of this unimaginable destruction, right?
Exactly. That rate, the absenteeism rate, was just 8%.
Wow, just 8%.
I know. Think about the mechanics of that for a second. With their neighborhoods completely pulverized, their infrastructure shattered, the sky literally raining fire.
Yeah.
92% of the workforce still woke up, navigated through the rubble of their ruined cities, and went to work to build weapons for the very government that was losing the war.
It defies logic.
It really does. If you are listening to this and thinking, how is that even mathematically or psychologically possible, or why wouldn't they just surrender? Well, you are definitely not alone.
Not at all. I mean, military planners and political leaders have agonized over that exact assumption for decades.
Right. So today, we are asking one fundamental question. Why doesn't bombing civilians force a country to surrender?
It is arguably one of the most important questions in modern history, really.
Absolutely. Welcome to our latest deep dive. I'm so glad you're here with us today.
Glad to be here.
We are going to be unpacking a massive stack of notes, historical data, and excerpts centered around Robert A. Pape's genuinely groundbreaking book, Bombing to Win, Air Power, and Coercion in War.
It's a heavy book, but it is fascinating.
It really is. And our core mission today is to kind of bypass all that dense military jargon and get straight into the aha moments of international strategy.
Right. We want to understand the underlying logic of how nations actually force their enemies to surrender.
Exactly. Why do some states just cave under pressure while others endure unimaginable suffering and just keep fighting?
We are going to look at the invisible machinery that keeps a nation running when, well, by all conventional logic, it really should just collapse.
And what we will discover is a complete paradigm shift. I mean, the conventional wisdom that you might hold about warfare, the stuff you see in movies or casual history, it's structurally flawed.
Yeah, it's almost entirely backwards.
Right. Pape's exhaustive analysis proves that in conventional warfare, trying to coerce an enemy by punishing their civilian population almost never works.
In fact, due to the psychological and political mechanics we are going to discuss, it frequently achieves the exact opposite of what the attacker intends.
Yeah, which is just wild to think about. Now, a very important quick note before we dive into the deep end of this material.
Wait, the framework.
Yeah, the framework. In this deep dive, we are going to be discussing historical conflicts, military strategies, and the actions of various nation-states.
And we are going to be doing this impartially.
Completely impartially. We are purely conveying the strategic realities and the cold, hard mathematics of coercion as analyzed in the source material.
Right. We are not endorsing any state's political, ideological, or moral viewpoints, past or present.
Exactly. We are simply looking at the structural mechanics of state behavior.
That is a vital framework for this discussion, honestly. To understand the mechanics of coercion, you really have to look at the data almost clinically.
Yeah, to sort of detach from it.
You do. You have to remove the emotional assumptions about how human beings should react to suffering and look at how massive, complex nation-states actually react when their survival is on the line.
Okay, so let's start right at the foundation.
Yeah.
Before we can even talk about forcing a surrender, we have to understand the difference between stopping an action and forcing a new one.
Right. This is crucial.
The source material draws a very hard line here between two concepts that people, often lump together: deterrence and coercion.
Yeah, this is the critical starting point. Deterrence is all about maintaining the status quo. It is the act of discouraging an opponent from doing something they haven't done yet. The mechanism is relatively straightforward, really. You are presenting a threat that makes the potential action seem just too costly.
Like putting up a warning sign.
Exactly. To use a simple framework, you put up a highly visible "beware of dog" sign, or you install a complex security system.
Right.
To stop a burglar from attempting to break into your house.
Right. You aren't asking the burglar to do anything. You're just asking them to continue not breaking into your house.
Precisely. Coercion, on the other hand, which some strategists actually refer to as compellence, is fundamentally different in its mechanics.
Because you aren't just trying to maintain the current reality. You're trying to actively change it.
Yes. Coercion seeks to force an opponent to alter their behavior. You are demanding that they stop an ongoing action or that they initiate a completely new one.
You're making the move.
Right. You are forcing them to step out of the status quo. And the historical record makes it abundantly clear that coercion is significantly harder to achieve than deterrence.
The book introduces a concept to explain this difficulty, calling it the aggressor's handicap. Let's break down the mechanics of why changing the status quo is so burdensome.
Sure. The aggressor's handicap is rooted in the fundamental asymmetry of how human beings and nation-states value territory.
Especially in our modern era of nationalism, right?
Exactly. In almost every conflict over land, the homeland territory is vastly more valuable to the defender than it is to the attacker.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanism here. Even if we assume a purely theoretical scenario where a piece of land has the exact same economic or strategic value to both sides.
Right. Equal value on paper.
The simple fact that one side already possesses it changes the psychological math, doesn't it?
That is precisely the mechanism. The attacker, who stands to make a gain, is naturally going to be more risk-averse than the defender, who stands to suffer a massive loss.
The loss aversion is huge.
It is. The psychological and political burden of losing what you already have is a much stronger motivator than the desire to acquire something new.
So they'll fight harder.
Much harder. The defender is almost always willing to absorb vastly higher costs and suffer much more physical and economic damage to keep their land than the attacker is ever willing to pay to take it.
Wow.
Plus, the attacker bears the entire logistical and political burden of disturbing the peace and initiating the conflict in the first place.
Okay, if you're listening to this and trying to visualize that asymmetry, think about it like this. It is the difference between convincing someone not to buy a piece of property they were looking at versus forcibly evicting someone from a house that their family has lived in for generations.
That's a perfect analogy.
The burden of changing the reality, of overcoming that incredibly deep baseline attachment, falls entirely on the entity trying to do the evicting.
Right.
The sheer friction of trying to push someone out of their established reality,
Right.
that is the aggressor's handicap.
That highlights the exact asymmetry perfectly. The victim of coercion, the state being told to surrender their territory, assumes a role very similar to the deterrer in a peacetime scenario.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The target state values the stakes at issue intensely because their national identity, their historical borders, and their security are intrinsically linked to that territory.
It's everything to them.
Exactly. Because of this intense valuation, the target state is mathematically and politically willing to accept incredibly high costs and immense risks to avoid conceding.
Which logically means that if you are the state trying to do the coercing, you are facing a massive uphill battle before a single shot is even fired.
Absolutely.
You have to be willing to go to extreme lengths just to overcome their baseline willingness to suffer.
You do. And this implies a fascinating limitation on state behavior. The text notes that potential assailants, the states who might want to coerce someone, are highly likely to be deterred from even attempting it.
Because it's too hard.
Right, unless they possess vastly superior military capabilities. They need a capability gap so massive that it can protect them from the victim's inevitable and highly motivated retaliation.
So if we extrapolate this logic and connect it to the bigger geopolitical picture, it explains a great deal about modern superpowers.
Yeah, it explains why you rarely see superpowers attempting to directly coerce other nuclear-armed superpowers.
Because the sheer cost of trying to alter the status quo against an enemy that has a massive capacity for retaliation, it just makes the math impossible.
Exactly. The aggressor's handicap in a superpower conflict is just too heavy.
The potential retaliation far outweighs the value of whatever change to the status quo the coercer might desire. So the status quo holds through deterrence, because coercion is structurally just too difficult.
That's the core of it, yes.
Okay, so if coercion is this incredibly heavy lift, if it requires overcoming this massive aggressor's handicap where the defender is willing to suffer immense pain,
Yeah.
how does the state actually do it? If you are a military planner, how do you mathematically force a surrender?
That brings us to the theoretical core of the analysis, the coercion equation. The source material provides a remarkably clear mathematical way to think about the decision calculus of a target state. It reduces the incredibly complex machinery of war into a rational formula.
Okay, let's hear the formula.
Resistance equals the benefits of resistance minus the costs of resistance. And importantly, both the benefits and the costs are multiplied by the probability of them actually happening.
So if I'm the leader of a country under attack, my decision to keep fighting, my resistance, is determined by weighing the value of what I get to keep against the pain I have to suffer to keep it.
Correct.
And then that's adjusted by how likely I think I am to succeed or fail.
That is the exact mechanism. A state only concedes, meaning the coercion campaign actually succeeds, when the mathematical value of resistance drops below zero.
Meaning the costs are just too high.
Right. The target state looks at the equation and realizes that the expected costs of resisting now mathematically outweigh the expected value of the territory or the political goal they are trying to protect.
But here is the catch. If I'm the attacking state, the coercer, I can't really manipulate how much the target values their own territory.
You cannot, no.
Like I can't suddenly convince them that the land their ancestors are buried on is actually worthless.
Exactly. The benefit side of the equation is largely fixed and immutable. Territorial interests are driven by deep-seated, slow-changing sociological forces.
We're talking about centuries of history here.
Right, centuries of nationalism, shared linguistic and cultural history, and pure, raw, power-balancing survival instincts. A coercer, by definition, is posing a severe existential threat to the target.
Yeah.
In that dynamic, the coercer have absolutely zero credibility or leverage to persuade the target that their homeland doesn't matter. The coercer cannot touch the benefits variable.
So the value of the land is locked in. It's a high number, and it isn't moving. That means the coercer has to manipulate the other sides of the equation.
Precisely. Since the benefits are fixed, the coercer is left with three other variables they can attempt to manipulate. And these three variables map perfectly onto the three overarching strategies of military coercion outlined in the analysis.
Let's lay those three strategies out clearly so we know what tools the military planners actually have in their toolbox.
Sure. Strategy number one focuses on the costs variable. This is the strategy of punishment.
Right, punishment.
The mechanism here is attempting to drastically raise the costs of continued resistance. This is the strategy of bombing cities, harming civilians, destroying the broader civilian economy.
Just making life miserable.
Exactly, trying to make everyday life so utterly unbearable that the target state's equation flips.
Okay, that's one.
Strategy number two focuses on the probability of costs. This is the risk strategy.
So not actual costs, but the threat of them.
Right. Instead of inflicting all the pain at once, this strategy is about raising the probability of future suffering. It is a slow, methodical, gradual escalation designed to signal to the target that much worse pain is coming down the line if they don't concede.
Like a warning shot, but escalating.
Exactly. And strategy number three focuses on the probability of benefits. This is the denial strategy.
In denial.
The mechanism here is reducing the probability that the target will actually achieve their goals. You do this by thwarting their specific military strategy entirely, making it impossible for them to hold the territory they value.
Okay, I want to pause here and really interrogate that first strategy. Punishment.
Let's do it.
Because if I am looking at this equation, and I know the enemy values their land incredibly highly, isn't the most direct, simplest solution just to make them hurt so badly that they give up?
It seems like it, right?
Yeah. Why isn't punishment the automatic, undeniable go-to strategy? It seems entirely logical that if you drop enough conventional bombs on enough cities, the society will just physically and psychologically break.
That intuitive leap, the idea that massive pain equals inevitable surrender, is exactly the assumption that dominated air power theory for decades throughout the 20th century. It seems like common sense. But this brings us to Pape's most counterintuitive and surprising revelation. Punishing civilians is a terrible way to win a conventional war.
It just doesn't work.
When you look at the historical record, it almost never works.
It is a massive paradox, the punishment paradox.
Yeah.
The idea that doing the most damage to the most people is actually structurally ineffective.
It is structurally ineffective because of a fundamental mismatch between the tools being used and the resilience of the target.
Okay, explain that mismatch.
The core issue is that conventional weapons, meaning high explosives, incendiaries, non-nuclear munitions, simply cannot inflict enough pain fast enough to overwhelm the massive territorial interests of a modern nation-state.
They just can't scale the damage fast enough.
Exactly. Modern states are incredibly, almost unimaginably resilient organisms. The author provides a deeply analytical breakdown of why punishment campaigns consistently fail to produce surrender, detailing 6 intersecting mechanisms.
Let's take our time and really unpack these mechanisms, because this totally shatters the narrative you usually get in the standard history class. Why doesn't bombing cities work?
Well, the first mechanism goes back to what we just discussed about the aggressor's handicap.
Right.
The territorial stakes in these conventional disputes are almost always tied to core national security or profound nationalist reasons. Because the baseline value of the benefits variable is so astronomically high, states are structurally preconditioned to accept astronomically high costs.
They walk into the fight ready to bleed.
Right. A punishment strategy only really works if the target has very minor peripheral interests at stake. But the irony is, if the interests are that minor, the coercer usually has minor interests too, and therefore isn't going to spend billions of dollars launching a massive sustained bombing campaign.
Right. Nobody mobilizes thousands of bombers and spends their entire national treasury over a minor disagreement about a fishing border.
Yeah.
The only time you launch a massive punishment campaign is when the stakes are massive, which means the enemy's willingness to suffer is also massive. They basically cancel each other out.
Precisely. They are structurally insulated from the start. That leads us to the second mechanism, which is the raw psychological power of nationalism.
Nationalism is huge.
It is. Individuals have a powerful, innate drive for national identity and social cohesion. Nationalism acts as an incredibly strong binding agent.
It glues everything together.
Yeah, it imbues everyday citizens with a deep personal attachment to the goals of the state. It transforms a political dispute over borders into a deeply personal narrative of survival and identity, making the average citizen willing to accept immense personal sacrifice.
Wow.
And what is truly fascinating here is how the structure of a government affects this. You might assume that a more democratic society would be softer, right?
Logically, yes. If the politicians answer to the people and the people are being bombed, the politicians should be forced to surrender to save their voters.
But the data shows the exact opposite. Yeah. Democratization actually intensifies nationalism. The more people feel they have a voice and participate in their government, the more they view the state as the true embodiment of their own values. They own the war.
Oh, that makes sense.
And this creates a devastating political trap that the text refers to as blowback.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of blowback.
Yeah.
How does a government trap itself?
Democracies and even authoritarian regimes that rely on maintaining high public enthusiasm often have to heavily sell their foreign policy to get the population fully on board with the sacrifices of war.
Right, you need propaganda.
They can't just say, we are fighting for a minor strategic advantage. They have to paint the conflict in absolute terms. They use rhetoric that frames the war as a battle of ultimate good versus absolute evil.
They demonize the enemy.
Exactly. They convince the public that securing this territory or defeating this enemy is utterly vital to the survival of the nation itself.
So they build this massive rhetorical structure to justify the war.
Yes, but once you build that structure, once you convince your own population that the stakes are existential and the enemy is evil, you trap yourself in your own narrative.
Oh, because now you can't back down.
Exactly. The leadership can no longer easily concede, even if the strategic reality changes or the bombing gets severe. If a democratic leader suddenly tries to surrender territory they just spent 3 years calling vital to our survival, it is political suicide.
The voters would tear them apart.
The public, who has internalized the propaganda and suffered for it, will absolutely turn on the leadership for backing down. The leadership is trapped by the blowback of their own mobilization efforts.
They hype the stakes up so intensely that finding an off-ramp becomes politically impossible. That is a brilliant point. The psychological rigidity just locks into place.
And that rigidity only hardens over time, which is the third mechanism, the concept of sunk costs.
Sunk costs, right.
Coercion almost always happens during an ongoing war, and the longer a society is at war, the more their willingness to tolerate costs increases.
Because they've already lost so much.
Exactly. Once a society has lost thousands of its young people, once cities have been damaged, the psychological need to justify those losses becomes overwhelming. You cannot bear to admit that all that previous suffering, the sunk cost, was for nothing.
Right. It has to mean something.
The societal narrative demands that the sacrifice be honored through uncompromising victory. The enemy becomes further demonized. In this environment, anyone even suggesting a negotiated surrender is viewed not just as weak, but as actively treasonous.
Wow.
The entire society transforms into a cohesive machine geared toward enduring whatever it takes.
So the psychology of the state, both at the leadership level and the civilian level, becomes functionally immune to the idea of surrender.
Pretty much.
But what about the physical reality? I mean, psychology is powerful, but eventually, if you destroy enough factories, burn enough farms, and destroy the economy, the state literally cannot function, right?
You think so?
Yeah, why can't a conventional bombing campaign just physically dismantle the society?
That is the assumption behind the fourth mechanism, and it's where the limits of conventional warfare really become apparent. Conventional munitions, even when used deliberately and massively against civilian centers, actually inflict surprisingly limited physical and demographic damage relative to the size of a modern nation.
Really? Limited damage.
Yes, coercers can kill people, they can destroy infrastructure, and they can cause starvation, but they can rarely destroy more than a very small proportion of the total population or the total industrial capacity.
If you are listening and wondering just how resilient these populations are, here is where the data from the source material is genuinely staggering.
It really is.
When we think of World War I and World War II, we think of total apocalyptic slaughter. But mathematically, in the context of entire nations, the battle deaths rarely exceeded 2% of the pre-war populations of the countries involved.
Right, 2%.
Only in a handful of incredibly devastated states did the losses even exceed 5%. The vast, overwhelming majority of the populations remained alive and functioning.
And we can look at the most extreme example of conventional punishment in history to see this mechanism at work. Consider the bombing of Japan in World War II.
Right, the firebombing.
It was the most aggressive, relentless, counter-civilian campaign ever conducted with non-nuclear weapons. Cities were largely constructed of wood and paper, and the firebombing tactics were specifically designed to exploit that vulnerability.
The destruction was apocalyptic. The text notes that this campaign killed an estimated 900,000 people.
900,000 dead is a horrific, almost incomprehensible human tragedy. But from the cold structural perspective of state coercion, we have to look at the denominator.
Right, out of how many?
The pre-war population of Japan was roughly 70 million. So that 900,000 figure, as devastating as it was, represents just over 1% of the total population.
About 1%.
Mathematically, 98-point-something% of the population survived. And that survival leads directly to the statistic you mentioned at the very beginning of our deep dive.
The absentee rate. At the climax of this unparalleled destruction in 1945, the absenteeism rate for Japanese factory workers was only around 8%.
That statistic perfectly illustrates the physical resilience of a mobilized society. The factories kept running, the workers kept showing up. The state continued to function and produce military output.
That's unbelievable.
Conventional weapons, no matter how aggressively deployed, could not break the physical continuity of the Japanese state.
Which leads us perfectly into the fifth reason the book outlines for the failure of punishment: substitution and adaptation. Because those workers weren't just stubbornly walking through the same intact streets, the state was actively managing the chaos.
Exactly. Modern states are not brittle glass structures that shatter at a specific breakpoint. They are dynamic, highly adaptable organisms.
They adapt.
When they are subjected to a punishment campaign, they don't just sit there and take the damage until they snap. They deteriorate incrementally, and more importantly, they actively compensate for the damage being inflicted.
What do they do?
They evacuate threatened populations to the countryside, they decentralize their manufacturing, they build vast networks of air defenses and shelters, they implement strict conservation and rationing measures.
They absorb the blow and shift their weight. The source material uses the historical attempts to blockade Britain as a perfect case study for this mechanism of adaptation.
The blockades against Britain are a classic example. Throughout history, during the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, and World War II, various enemy powers looked at Britain's geography and recognized a massive vulnerability.
It's an island.
Exactly. Britain is an island nation that relied incredibly heavily on imported food and raw materials to survive. The logic was simple. Use a naval blockade, specifically submarines in the 20th century, to sever those import lines and starve the population until the government is forced to surrender.
It seems like a foolproof strategy.
Yeah.
If you stop the food from entering the island, they have to give up or starve?
Yeah, it failed every single time.
Wow. Every time.
Every single time. And it failed because the attackers fundamentally underestimated the administrative and adaptive capacity of the modern British state. When the food imports dropped, the British government didn't just throw its hands up.
Right.
They radically reorganized their entire society. They implemented massive, scientifically calculated rationing systems to ensure equitable distribution of whatever calories were available. They changed their agricultural practices almost overnight, converting pastures, public parks, and private gardens into high-yield farmland for staple crops like potatoes.
They basically turned the whole country into a farm.
Yes, they discovered alternative sources for vital materials.
So they didn't just endure the shortage, they fundamentally changed how their society generated and consumed resources.
Precisely. The critical mechanism here is the rate of adaptation. The ability of the British state to compensate for the shortages actually grew faster than their dependence on the imports they were losing.
That is fascinating.
The blockades caused immense hardship and frustration, yes, but they never came close to structurally starving the state into a surrender because the state was just too adaptable.
Okay, I understand the physical resilience now. The economy adapts, the people survive. But surely if you bomb a population heavily enough or starve them long enough, a psychological breaking point must exist, right?
You'd assume so.
Like, even if they have enough calories to physically survive, won't they eventually grow to hate their own leaders for getting them into a war that brought hell down on their cities? Won't they rise up and overthrow the government?
This is the sixth mechanism the book addresses.
Yeah, and it takes a sledgehammer to the widely held myth of the bomb-induced revolution.
It absolutely demolishes that myth. The assumed causal chain that military planners relied on was simple. Civilian hardship produces massive public anger, which then translates into organized political opposition, which finally culminates in a revolution that overthrows the stubborn government and signs a surrender.
Right, that's the logic.
The source material tells us, using vast amounts of data, that this causal chain is fundamentally flawed at almost every link. First, the data shows that pure economic deprivation and physical hardship do not, on their own, cause successful popular unrest.
Why not? If people are cold, hungry, and getting bombed, shouldn't they be furious?
They are furious. But economic deprivation causes personal frustration. You are angry about the lack of bread or the destruction of your neighborhood.
Right.
But collective, organized political violence or revolution requires something deeper. It requires the population to fundamentally doubt the moral worth and the legitimacy of the entire political system.
Oh, I see.
You don't overthrow a government just because you are mad about food shortages. You overthrow it when you are politically alienated from the structure of the state itself. Hardship alone does not automatically create that political alienation, especially when the state is using propaganda to blame the hardship on the enemy.
And actually, that brings up a fascinating psychological point from the text. The bombing often tends to make the civilian population hate the attackers significantly more than they hate their own government.
Exactly. International disputes, especially when one's homeland is under direct attack, reliably create a powerful rally around the flag effect.
Yeah.
In both Germany and Japan during World War II, surveys and historical records show that the populations continued to work exhaustingly for the war effort long after they had privately stopped believing their own government's claims that they were going to win the war.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting out of a grim sense of national duty and a profound hatred for the forces bombing them.
The psychological data the text highlights here regarding how humans process trauma during these campaigns is just incredible. The book describes how heavy punishment induces what it calls a survival response.
The survival response is a crucial psychological mechanism. When a society is subjected to truly heavy, devastating bombardment, the population doesn't suddenly transform into hyper-organized political activists.
They don't have the energy for it.
Exactly. They don't form underground revolutionary committees. Instead, they become deeply politically apathetic. Their entire cognitive load shrinks down to the immediate visceral needs of the present moment.
Just staying alive.
Right. If your city is turned to rubble, you aren't spending your energy planning a coup against the national leadership. You are spending every waking ounce of energy looking for clean water, securing temporary shelter, and trying to locate your missing family members. Extreme trauma fractures the societal bonds needed for a revolution and forces everyone into a deeply localized individual survival mode.
Let me share another data point from the text that completely blew my mind regarding this resilience.
Oh, the Blitz data.
Yeah. During the Blitz and the later bombing campaigns over the UK in World War II, English workers lost an average of only 6 days from work following the largest, most devastating bombing raids.
6 days.
And here's the kicker. That 6-day average was only for the people whose actual physical houses were directly destroyed.
Wow.
If a worker's house was fine, but the rest of their neighborhood was smoking ruins, they generally went to work the very next morning. 6 days to recover from losing everything you own, and then you are back on the assembly line.
That is the survival response in action. The routine of work, the necessity of earning whatever wages or rations are available, supersedes abstract political action.
It's unbelievable.
And we see similar psychological resilience when we look at the survey data from Germany. The Allies surveyed German civilians after the war to gauge their attitudes toward their wartime leadership.
Okay, what did they find?
In German towns that had been largely untouched by the bombing campaigns, 62% of the population expressed that they had maintained trust in their national leaders during the war.
Unbombed towns, 62%.
Right. In the towns that had been heavily bombed, reduced to rubble, that number was 48%.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing that correctly. Having your entire city systematically dismantled from the air only dropped the trust in the government by 14 percentage points.
Exactly. 48% versus 62%. It is a drop, certainly, but it is hardly the catastrophic collapse in morale that the architects of the bombing campaigns predicted.
That's practically a rounding error in terms of revolution.
It is not a decisive revolutionary shift. Almost half the population in the smoking ruins still trusted the government that put them there. And here is where the psychological data gets incredibly counterintuitive.
Okay, what is it?
Light bombing, what the text refers to as the Pearl Harbor effect, actually achieves the opposite of coercion. It increases public anger toward the attacker and fuels demands for even more aggressive reprisals.
Because it's enough to piss them off, but not enough to trigger that apathetic survival response.
Precisely. It breaches the threshold of insult without crossing the threshold of incapacitation. The text notes a fascinating survey of British civilians during the war.
Oh yeah, I read this part.
The civilians who had not experienced heavy air attacks in their own towns were actually statistically more likely to favor aggressively bombing Berlin than the British civilians who were actually living through the Blitz in London.
That is wild. The people suffering the least wanted the most revenge, while the people actually getting bombed were just focused on enduring.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply counterintuitive human psychology is under the stress of conflict. If you rely on simplistic assumptions about pain causing surrender, your strategy is going to fail against the complex realities of human resilience.
So, if we synthesize all of this, what does this mean for the mechanics of starting a revolution? Because if you look at history, revolutions do happen during wars. Governments do get overthrown.
They absolutely do.
But if we just proved that bombing civilians and inflicting economic hardship doesn't make the people rise up and successfully overthrow their leaders, what is the actual catalyst? What is the mechanism that breaks a state from the inside?
To understand that mechanism, we have to look past the civilian population and examine the stark physical mechanics of state control.
Okay.
The fundamental truth of statecraft is this. As long as a government maintains the loyalty of a well-armed, cohesive, and functioning military, they can easily and ruthlessly crush almost any unorganized, poorly armed civilian dissent.
Right. It doesn't matter if you have 1 million angry citizens marching in the streets.
Yeah.
If they are armed with pitchforks or even smuggled civilian rifles, they simply cannot defeat a coordinated military force equipped with tanks, artillery, and disciplined command structures.
Exactly.
The math of violence heavily favors the state.
Exactly. A relatively small contingent of loyal, well-trained soldiers can effortlessly disperse or decapitate a massive civilian movement. Repression is an incredibly effective tool for maintaining power.
So repression works.
It does.
Yeah.
So if you are an attacker and your strategy relies on precipitating a revolution in the target state to force a surrender, there is only one true, reliable recipe for success.
What is it?
You cannot focus on the civilians. You must focus on the monopoly of violence. You must smash the state's army on the battlefield.
You have to break the shield that protects the government.
Yes. A successful revolution during wartime depends entirely on the disintegration of rank-and-file military support for the existing government. And the supreme, most potent solvent for military loyalty is large-scale, catastrophic battlefield defeat.
Walk me through the psychological shift for the soldiers. Why does a battlefield defeat turn them against their own government?
Well, when soldiers are fed into a meat grinder, when they suffer catastrophic casualties because of what they perceive as incompetent leadership or a futile strategy, the military cohesion breaks down.
They feel betrayed.
Exactly. They realize their leadership has betrayed them. They mutiny. They desert. And the crucial mechanism here is what happens when they return home.
What do?
They return disgruntled, highly motivated to take revenge on the politicians who sent them to die, and, most importantly, they return home with their weapons and their military training.
They provide the actual firepower that the civilian populace lacks.
Precisely. They form the hardened, armed nucleus of a revolutionary force. When the mutinous military links up with the frustrated civilian populace, it neutralizes the state's ability to repress the opposition.
That makes total sense.
That is when political opposition can actually take power. It is the destruction of the army, not the suffering of the civilians, that opens the door for revolution.
The source material provides some incredibly vivid, detailed historical examples that perfectly illustrate this mechanism. Let's look at the Russian Revolution in 1917.
The Russian Revolution is a textbook example. In the summer of 1916, the Imperial Russian Army launched the Brusilov Offensive. It was their largest and most ambitious offensive of World War I.
But it didn't go well.
No. Strategically, it ended in total disaster. The Imperial Army suffered over 1 million casualties. The sheer scale of the slaughter shattered the morale and the organizational cohesion of the Russian military.
Your shield was broken.
Completely broken. By early 1917, Russian cities were literally swarming with armed, disillusioned deserters from the front lines.
Wow.
So when the popular civilian revolts over food shortages and political alienation finally started in Petrograd, the critical shift occurred. When the Tsar ordered the military garrisons to suppress the civilian protests, the mechanism that usually keeps a state in power, the soldiers simply refused.
You wouldn't shoot them.
They didn't shoot the protesters, they joined them, they handed out weapons. The state evaporated because the army had been conceptually and physically destroyed on the battlefield months earlier.
And we see the exact same mechanism play out just a year later with the German Revolution in 1918, right?
Yes, the parallels are striking. By late 1918, the Allies had successfully defeated the last major German spring offensives. The German army was suffering massive casualties, and the leadership recognized they had lost the capacity to hold the front lines.
The war was over.
The military reality was undeniable defeat, yet in October of 1918, the German Naval Command ordered the sailors of the High Seas Fleet at Kiel to put to sea for a massive, final battle against the British Royal Navy.
A suicide mission.
It was widely understood by the sailors to be a pointless suicide mission designed merely to save the honor of the naval officer class.
And the sailors, who knew the war was already lost on the battlefield, just looked at the orders and said no.
They absolutely refused to sail. They mutinied. And because the broader German military apparatus was already exhausted and demoralized by the battlefield defeats, the government lacked the loyal forces necessary to crush the mutiny at Kiel.
And then it just spread.
That mutiny spread like wildfire across the military and into the civilian populace across Germany, leading directly to the Kaiser abdicating his throne and the formal end of the war. Again, it was the military breaking, not the civilians, that forced the political collapse.
The book also brings up a much more recent example, the uprisings in Iraq in 1991 following the Gulf War.
Which perfectly validates the theory in a modern context. During the Gulf War, the coalition heavily bombed Iraqi infrastructure and military targets. But the internal uprisings against Saddam Hussein by the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north did not happen during the peak of the civilian hardship.
Really? When did they happen?
The uprisings only ignited after the Iraqi army had been functionally routed and suffered a catastrophic, visible battlefield defeat by the coalition ground forces in Kuwait.
It's the same pattern.
Yes. It was only when the returning, defeated, and disorganized soldiers linked up with the disaffected civilian populations that the uprisings gained the critical mass necessary to challenge the regime.
So the lesson for military planners is brilliantly clear, if utterly counter to popular assumption. If your goal is to coerce a target state by encouraging a domestic revolution, you cannot just burn their cities, starve their people, and hope the civilians get angry enough to overthrow the government.
No, that won't work.
You have to locate their army, engage it, and systematically destroy it on the battlefield.
Smashing the army, neutralizing the state's monopoly on violence, is the only historically validated key to sparking a revolution. Punishing civilians is a strategic dead end.
Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift. Let's reset our analytical framework.
Let's do it.
We have completely ruled out the first strategy in our coercion equation, punishment. We know that bombing civilians doesn't mathematically tip the scales because states are too resilient, blowback locks leaders into conflict, and hoping for a spontaneous civilian uprising is a myth.
Exactly.
So if pure physical punishment doesn't work, what about playing a psychological game? What if we don't destroy everything at once, but we slowly, deliberately turn up the heat?
Right.
This brings us to the second manipulable variable in the equation, the risk strategy.
Right. If the punishment strategy is about inflicting the maximum amount of actual damage right now, the risk strategy is about manipulating the fear of future damage. The coercer deliberately inflicts civilian costs, but at a heavily regulated, gradually increasing rate. The psychological mechanism is designed to signal to the opponent, look at what we just did. We are holding back. Comply with our demands or we will escalate and much worse is coming.
You leave them a way out.
Exactly. You temporarily pause the bombing or the attacks to allow time for negotiation. The guiding principle is trying not to kill the hostage, meaning you don't want to destroy everything of value immediately because once everything is destroyed, you have no leverage left.
Makes sense.
You have nothing left to threaten them with. You want to keep the sword dangling over their head.
If you're listening to this, it probably sounds very clever on paper. It's an elegant, almost academic approach to warfare. If you think about it like a game of poker, the risk strategy is like a player who never goes all in, but just keeps making minimum raises every single round.
Exactly.
They're trying to signal to the other player that they have a monster hand, and the pain is just going to keep increasing until the other player finally folds.
That is a perfect analogy because it highlights exactly why the risk strategy consistently fails in the real world.
Does it?
Oh, absolutely. The text systematically dismantles the logic of the risk strategy. First of all, let's go back to the physical limits of conventional weapons we discussed earlier. In a conventional war, you can never really kill the hostage anyway.
Right. The damage ceiling.
The damage from conventional bombs accumulates so slowly relative to the size of a nation that you can almost always find more targets to hit. So the distinction between a massive punishment strategy and a gradual risk strategy is already blurred in practice.
But the real structural flaw of the risk strategy is the mechanism of credibility, isn't it?
Exactly. The entire foundation of the risk strategy rests on credibility. You are trying to increase the credibility of your threat by showing a deliberate pattern of increasing damage.
You want them to believe you'll go all the way.
You want the enemy to believe that you are fully prepared to wipe them off the map, but in reality, the mechanism backfires. Gradual escalation actually reduces the credibility of your threat.
Walk me through the psychology of the target state. Why does seeing a slow escalation make them less afraid?
Put yourself in the shoes of the target leadership. You are watching the coercer execute these slow, highly restrained, paused attacks. You don't look at that and think, wow, they possess an unstoppable will and are slowly building up to destroying our entire society.
What do you think instead?
You look at their hesitation and you think, aha, they are holding back because they are fundamentally restrained by their own internal political constraints.
They see the minimum raises and realize the poker player is actually terrified to go all in.
Precisely. The target correctly assumes that the coercer's domestic public is squeamish about causing large-scale civilian suffering, or that the coercing government is terrified that a massive, unrestricted attack will provoke a third-party superpower to intervene in the conflict.
Right.
Instead of being convinced of the coercer's unwavering resolve to inflict maximum damage, the opponent becomes utterly convinced that the coercer will never escalate far above the current restrained levels.
Because if they had the political will to destroy you, they would have just done it on day one.
Exactly. And furthermore, the slow, paused pace of the risk strategy provides the target state with a massive tactical advantage.
How so?
It gives them ample time to adjust their own tactics, regenerate their military losses, build air defenses, and harden their society.
The book cites a very specific historical example to illustrate the failure of the risk strategy. The 1986 US bombing of Libya. Let's unpack the mechanics of that operation.
In 1986, the United States sought to coerce the Libyan government, led by Muammar Gaddafi, to cease its sponsorship of international terrorism. The U.S. launched a military strike, Operation El Dorado Canyon, but the operation was strictly limited to a single, highly targeted raid.
Just one raid. Why was it so limited?
Because the coercer, the United States, faced intense internal and external political constraints. The American public was not prepared for a massive sustained war in the Middle East, and key U.S. allies in Europe were highly reluctant to support extensive, prolonged military operations that might destabilize the region or disrupt oil supplies.
And the target, Libya, can see all of this political maneuvering. They read the same news.
Yes. They see the single raid, and they recognize it not as the beginning of an inevitable escalating doom, but as the absolute maximum effort the U.S. political system can currently stomach.
That's all they've got.
The text concludes that risk strategies are rarely masterful psychological games. They're usually just watered-down, ineffective punishment strategies deployed by leaders who fundamentally lack the political capital or the will to actually fight a total war, and the target always recognizes that weakness.
Okay, let's take a breath and reset the board, because we have eliminated a lot of options. We have analyzed the coercion equation. We know that the benefits of resisting are locked in tight by the deep forces of nationalism and territorial security.
Right.
We have completely ruled out a punishment strategy because conventional weapons simply cannot raise the physical cost high enough to break a modern, adaptable, deeply nationalistic society. And we have just ruled out the risk strategy because slowly increasing the probability of those costs just broadcasts your own political weakness and gives the enemy precious time to adapt.
Which logically leaves us with exactly one manipulable variable left in the equation.
We have to reduce the probability that the target will actually achieve their territorial benefits in the first place.
Right.
This brings us to the core thesis of Pape's work, the denial strategy.
This is the ultimate conclusion of the analysis. Coercion in conventional military disputes works best, and arguably only works reliably when it is strictly directed at military vulnerabilities, not civilian ones.
Okay.
You must systematically undermine the target state's confidence in its own specific military strategy.
To translate that into plain English, you have to mathematically convince the enemy leadership that they cannot win, no matter how much pain they are willing to endure.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanism. A state is willing to pay massive costs in blood and treasure. They are willing to see their cities bombed and their citizens rationed, only if they actually expect to gain or hold the territory at the end of the conflict.
Because victory makes it worth it.
If they believe victory is possible, no amount of pain will stop them. Therefore, the task for the coercer is to identify and violently thwart the specific military strategy the enemy is relying on to control that disputed territory.
You don't attack their will to fight, you attack their capacity to execute their plan.
Yes. If the target state's leadership looks at the battlefield and concludes that their military strategy has been fundamentally broken and that they cannot achieve their goals at any price, then continued resistance becomes mathematically and politically pointless.
The math flips.
When they surrender under a denial strategy, they aren't surrendering because their cities are suffering. They are surrendering because fighting is futile and they want to avoid further pointless military losses that gain them nothing.
Okay, I have to push back here because this sounds suspiciously like normal warfare. If I am a military general and I am targeting the enemy's military forces to thwart their strategy, isn't that just fighting a war?
It sounds like it, yeah.
How is coercion by denial conceptually any different from just going out there and achieving a total military victory?
It is a fantastic question, and it addresses a very subtle but crucial gray area in military theory. If we connect this to the bigger picture, both coercion by denial and traditional warfighting, what we might call brute force, seek identical end goals. You want the enemy to stop fighting and concede the territory.
Right.
But the mechanism of how they get to that end state is entirely different.
Walk me through the difference in the mechanism.
Let's define brute force, or true military victory. Brute force means you engage and rout the opposing military forces on the battlefield until they are physically completely defenseless.
Total destruction.
You systematically dismantle their military apparatus until the defeated government is brought to a point where they literally no longer control organized forces capable of resisting your advance. You don't need their agreement to take the territory because they have no capacity left to stop you.
This is exactly what happened to Germany in May of 1945. They fought the Allies until the bitter absolute end. They didn't choose to surrender while they still had options. They surrendered because their military was physically annihilated. Couldn't organize a coherent defense of Berlin if they wanted to.
Yeah.
That is brute force.
Precisely. The political decision to surrender was irrelevant because the physical capacity to resist was gone. Coercion by denial, on the other hand, operates on a different timeline. It successfully forces the enemy leadership to make the political decision to surrender while they still retain a significant capacity for organized military resistance.
Oh, I see. They still have bullets, they still have soldiers, but they see the writing on the wall.
Yes. They observed the systematic degradation of their critical military capabilities. They realized that their specific strategy to win the war is fundamentally doomed, and they make a rational, calculated political decision that accepting your demands right now is less costly to the survival of their state than fighting a futile war to the bitter, inevitable end.
Which brings us back to Japan in August of 1945.
Exactly. This is the vital distinction. When the Japanese leadership surrendered, they were not militarily dismantled to the last man. They still had millions of troops under arms, both on the home islands and across Asia.
They were still heavily armed.
They possessed thousands of aircraft. They had the physical capacity to inflict massive casualties on an invading force. But their overarching strategy, which was to make an invasion so bloody that the U.S. would negotiate, was thwarted by the total severing of their logistical lines, the destruction of their navy, and ultimately the realization that the U.S. could destroy them from the air without ever launching a ground invasion.
They realized their strategy was dead.
They were coerced.
So, coercion by denial is essentially achieving the political goal on the cheap. You secure the surrender and save potentially hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides by ending the war before total physical annihilation of the enemy army becomes necessary.
That is the ultimate value of the denial strategy. It forces the political collapse before the physical collapse is completed.
Okay, so if I am a military planner, how do I actually execute a denial strategy? The text heavily emphasizes that it is not just about randomly blowing up enemy tanks or dropping bombs on random barracks. It is entirely about the specific interaction between your attacks and the enemy's unique military strategy.
Right. Simply destroying targets of general military value is not sufficient for coercion. You have to destroy the specific load-bearing pillars that their unique strategy relies on.
The critical points of failure.
The text illustrates this by deeply contrasting how a denial strategy must shift when facing the two main typologies of modern warfare: mechanized war and guerrilla war.
Let's dive deep into mechanized warfare first. This is your classic World War II or Desert Storm scenario, right? Massive armies, armored columns, defined front lines. What is the mechanism of a mechanized army?
Mechanized war relies on deploying massive, heavily armed forces to fight intense, large-scale, highly coordinated battles. To succeed, this strategy requires a monstrous logistical tail.
Lots of supplies.
Think of a modern mechanized division not just as a group of soldiers, but as an incredibly needy, massive industrial organism. It consumes thousands of gallons of diesel fuel every single day. It requires hundreds of tons of artillery shells, specialized spare parts, and food. All of this must flow constantly, without interruption, from centralized rear depots to the combat units on the front line.
And the text points out that these logistical demands are highly inelastic, meaning a tank literally cannot substitute its need for diesel fuel with anything else. If the fuel stops flowing, the tank is just a highly expensive stationary metal box.
Exactly. The strategy is incredibly brittle. So to coerce a mechanized army via a denial strategy, you don't necessarily try to bomb every single tank on the front line. You target their inelastic logistics.
You choke them out.
You use air power or precision strikes to disrupt their communications networks. You bomb their centralized supply lines, their massive fuel depots, the key bridges, and the railheads.
You sever the arteries that keep the industrial organism alive.
Yes, because their entire strategy of fighting large-scale battles is so entirely dependent on these massive centralized logistical flows, the strategy breaks down remarkably quickly when you interrupt them. You paralyze the network that allows them to function as a coordinated, mechanized force.
Makes sense.
Once the enemy leadership realizes they physically cannot supply their front lines, they know their strategy is thwarted. They know defeat is inevitable, and they become ripe for coercion.
The structural vulnerability is the supply chain. But what about the other end of the spectrum? What about guerrilla warfare? Because that is a totally different strategic beast.
It is the exact opposite in almost every structural way. A guerrilla warfare strategy does not aim to win massive set-piece battles against armored columns. It aims to slowly gain political and physical control over the population, usually starting in remote rural villages.
Right.
Guerrillas fight in very small, highly dispersed units. There is no well-defined front line. Combat is intermittent, fleeting, and extremely low intensity.
Which logically means their logistical footprint must be entirely different.
Exactly. The organism of a guerrilla force is completely decentralized. A guerrilla fighter doesn't need a diesel supply chain. They need a bowl of rice, a rifle, and a handful of bullets. They live off the local population.
They blend in.
They don't use centralized rail networks, they use invisible footpaths under dense jungle canopies. Their logistical footprint is practically zero.
So from the perspective of a coercer trying to apply a denial strategy, this makes a guerrilla force incredibly frustrating, almost mathematically impossible to defeat from the air.
It does. They simply do not have the massive centralized vulnerabilities that a mechanized army has. They don't have massive fuel dumps for you to bomb. They don't have vulnerable rail yards.
You have nothing to target.
You can fly bombers over the jungle and drop explosives all day long, but you are not thwarting their strategy because their strategy does not rely on the infrastructure you are destroying. You cannot sever an artery that doesn't exist.
So the fundamental lesson here is that matching the coercer strategy directly to the target's specific vulnerabilities is the only way denial works. If you take an air campaign designed to cripple the logistics of a mechanized army and try to use it against a decentralized guerrilla force, you will fail completely.
Completely. And this mechanism also highlights why a target state always has a vote in whether coercion succeeds. Even against a mechanized army, the target has ways to minimize the effects of your attacks.
How so?
If they have built a massive cushion of extra supplies near the front, or if they have the industrial capacity to regenerate their losses faster than you can inflict them, your denial strategy will fail.
The text mentions the Red Army in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa as the ultimate example of this regenerative capacity.
Yes. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they inflicted what should have been mathematically fatal blows. In the first few months of 1941, the Red Army lost over 3 million men.
3 million?
They lost staggering amounts of tanks, aircraft, and territory. By all conventional military logic, their capacity to fight a mechanized war should have been denied.
But they didn't surrender.
They didn't because the Soviet state possessed an unparalleled, ruthless capacity for regeneration. They physically disassembled their factories, moved them thousands of miles east behind the Ural Mountains, and rebuilt them.
While under attack.
They mobilized millions of new soldiers. By the next summer, they had regenerated massive new armies. Germany could not deny them their strategy because the Soviet machine just continuously rebuilt itself under fire.
So executing a denial strategy is a highly complex game of strategic chess. You can't just blindly throw punches. You have to clinically analyze the opponent's strategy, identify the single load-bearing pillar of that strategy, and destroy it so thoroughly that they cannot adapt or regenerate.
Yes, and mastering that analytical process is the only reliable way to achieve coercion in conventional military conflicts.
Okay, we have laid out the rules of the game. We have solved the puzzle of conventional warfare. We know how to overcome the aggressor's handicap using denial. But there is a massive looming exception to everything we have just spent the last hour discussing.
The atomic bomb.
Right. Everything we have covered up to this point. The abject failure of the punishment strategy, the incredible resilience of populations, the absolute necessity of targeting military strategies via denial. All of that applies exclusively to a world using conventional weapons.
Yes.
But the invention of nuclear weapons doesn't just change the rules, it flips the entire board completely upside down.
It is the ultimate paradigm shift in military history. In disputes involving nuclear weapons, Pape's analysis concludes that the old conventional wisdom, the ideas that were so wrong for conventional war, are actually completely correct.
In a nuclear context, coercion succeeds precisely by manipulating civilian vulnerability.
Exactly.
Walk me through the mechanism of this sudden reversal. Why do the rules of human resilience suddenly stop applying?
Well, it all comes down to the brutal mathematics of capacity. Remember, we established that conventional punishment fails because conventional weapons just physically cannot do enough damage fast enough.
Right, there's a limit to how many bombs you can drop.
You can only fly so many bomber sorties a day. You can only kill a small percentage of a population. Because the damage is incremental, a modern society can adapt, substitute, ration, and endure. But nuclear weapons shatter that ceiling. They possess a nearly unlimited, instantaneous capacity to inflict pain.
A single bomb, delivered in a fraction of a second, can vaporize the city, destroy the infrastructure, and kill millions.
Exactly. The horrific levels of societal destruction inherent in a nuclear attack are so immense, so absolute, that they completely dominate the decision-making calculus of any state.
You can't adapt to it.
No modern nation-state, no matter how intensely nationalistic or well-organized, is resilient enough to withstand nuclear punishment. You cannot ration your way out of a nuclear holocaust. You cannot adapt when your entire industrial and administrative base is erased in an afternoon.
So how do our three strategies, punishment, risk, and denial, function under this terrifying nuclear umbrella. Let's start with the champion of conventional war. Denial. If denial is the best way to win a conventional conflict, does it still hold up with nukes?
Actually, in a nuclear scenario, the denial strategy becomes almost entirely irrelevant.
Really? Why?
Think about the underlying logic of denial. The goal is to thwart the enemy's military strategy so they cannot hold a specific piece of disputed territory. But in a nuclear scenario, the scale of violence renders the territory moot.
Because it's all gone anyway.
Who cares about holding a specific border region or a specific province if your entire society, your capital, and your civilization have been vaporized? The existential threat to the civilian population implied by any use of nuclear weapons is so overwhelming that it makes the tactical military impact secondary.
Right.
You don't need to surgically thwart their tank battalions with a denial strategy if you have the capacity to simply erase their nation.
Okay, that makes horrifying sense. So what about the punishment strategy? If conventional punishment fails because it lacks capacity, nuclear punishment must work flawlessly, right?
Purely logically, yes. A massive nuclear punishment campaign would be undeniably effective at coercion because absolutely no target could physically or psychologically resist it. The expected costs would instantly and infinitely exceed any possible benefits of resistance.
The equation just plummets below zero instantly.
Exactly. However, the text notes that actual executed nuclear punishment is exceedingly rare in practice.
Because actually doing it carries a different kind of cost.
Precisely. Actually executing a massive nuclear punishment campaign would not only irradiate and destroy the very territory you might be disputing, rendering it useless, but it would earn the coercing state a reputation for unparalleled, unthinkable barbarism.
You would become a global pariah.
The diplomatic and moral costs to the coercer are astronomical.
Which surprisingly leaves us with the strategy that we completely dismissed as a weak bluff in conventional war.
Yeah.
The risk strategy.
Yes. Risk the threat of future gradual escalation becomes the supreme and most effective tool in the realm of nuclear coercion.
This is a fascinating inversion. We established earlier that in a conventional war, if you act like the poker player, making minimum raises, or you count 1, 2, 2.5, you look weak.
Right.
You signal that you are politically constrained. Why does that exact same gradual mechanism suddenly work when you introduce nukes?
Because the nature of the threat is fundamentally different. Unlike conventional threats, which have a low ceiling of potential damage, nuclear threats raise the prospect of so much absolute existential harm that they can coerce a target without ever needing to be fully implemented.
I don't have to follow through.
You do not have to actually drop 10 nuclear bombs to prove to the enemy that you are serious. Dropping just one, or conducting a highly visible nuclear test, or even just publicly moving your strategic bombers to a high alert status sends a terrifying, undeniable signal.
The target knows you have the absolute capacity for total annihilation, so the slow escalation isn't seen as a bluff, it's seen as a countdown to the apocalypse.
Exactly. The risk is suddenly infinitely credible and utterly overwhelming. The target is forced to concede because the tiny probability of total annihilation outweighs any conceivable territorial benefit.
But this raises a massively important geopolitical question. To pull this off, to successfully coerce another nation by waving a nuclear risk in their face, the coercer must possess absolute nuclear superiority, right?
Absolutely. This is the vital, limiting condition that the text lays out for nuclear coercion. It requires stark superiority.
Because if they can hit back,
If the target state also possesses an assured destruction capability, meaning if you launch a nuke at them, they have enough surviving submarines or silos to launch nukes back at your cities before they die, then you, the coercer, are entirely deterred from ever starting the game.
the classic Cold War doctrine, mutually assured destruction, EMD.
Exactly. If both sides have survivable nuclear arsenals, coercion becomes mathematically almost impossible. Neither side can credibly threaten nuclear punishment or risk without actively committing national suicide. The costs of coercion become infinite for the coercer as well.
Right.
Therefore, nuclear coercion really only functions effectively if a nuclear-armed state is coercing a non-nuclear state, or if one superpower possesses a massive, undeniable first-strike advantage that completely eliminates the other's ability to retaliate.
Which explains so much of the terrifying posturing during the Cold War. The constant frantic arms race for more missiles and better submarines wasn't just about preparing to win a war. It was about trying to buy back the strategic ability to coerce the other side.
Yes.
Or ensuring the other side could never coerce you.
Precisely. To summarize the massive conceptual shift, The conventional wisdom that you win conflicts by threatening to punish civilian populations is tragically correct for the apocalyptic realm of nuclear disputes, but it is a structural fallacy for conventional conflicts.
This has been an absolutely incredible, rigorous journey through the hidden mechanics of warfare, human resilience, and statecraft. We have unpacked a tremendous amount of strategic logic today. Let me try to synthesize and summarize the main takeaways for everyone listening so we can lock these concepts in.
It's a lot to digest.
First, we learned that because of the aggressor's handicap, deterrence is always mathematically and psychologically easier than coercion. The defender, bound by nationalism and survival instincts, almost always values their homeland more than the attacker values taking it. Second, we explored the math of the coercion equation. Coercion relies on manipulating either the cost of resistance or the probability of success. And we learned the hard way that trying to raise the costs by punishing civilians usually backfires.
The punishment paradox.
The punishment paradox shows us that modern states are physically adaptable, they're protected by sunk costs, and democratic blowback locks their leaders into uncompromising positions.
And importantly, we dispelled the enduring myth of the bomb-induced revolution. We established that revolutions do not happen just because civilians are starved or bombed into apathy. True revolutions occur when the state's monopoly on violence is broken, when the military is smashed on the battlefield, mutinies, and turns its weapons against its own masters.
Right, and we saw the playing psychological games with the risk strategy, slowly escalating conventional attacks, just signals political weakness to the enemy and gives them precious time to repair. We learned that in conventional conflicts, the only historically validated way to force a surrender is through a strict strategy of denial.
You must clinically analyze the enemy's specific military strategy.
Identify its load-bearing vulnerability, like the massive logistical tail of a mechanized army, and relentlessly deny them the physical ability to succeed. You have to make them realize that fighting is mathematically futile.
Until, of course, you introduce the terrifying capacity of nuclear weapons into the equation, which flips the rules entirely, rendering military denial irrelevant and making civilian vulnerability the ultimate horrifying leverage.
It is a profound, deeply clinical framework for understanding history. It changes how you look at every war of the 20th century. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, something to really mull over on your own as you look at the world today.
Okay, what is it?
We've spent this deep dive looking at Pape's theories, strictly through the historical lens of air power, kinetic military force, and bombs. But think about how the landscape of global conflict is shifting right now. If conventional punishment strategies fail because modern nation-states are highly resilient, deeply adaptable, and driven by fierce nationalism, how does this framework apply to non-kinetic coercion?
That is arguably the million-dollar strategic question for the 21st century.
Exactly. Think about the tools we use today. Are modern, sweeping economic sanctions or massive, crippling cyber attacks on a nation's financial infrastructure just the modern equivalent of a punishment strategy?
It's a great comparison.
We deploy them specifically to inflict broad economic and societal pain, hoping that the pressure will force a government to change its behavior. But if the underlying theory we just spent an hour discussing holds true across the board, do these modern tools suffer from the exact same structural flaws as the bombing campaigns of World War II?
Do they just cause blowback?
Exactly. Do widespread sanctions just inflict civilian pain, trigger a nationalist rally around the flag effect, encourage the state to build resilient shadow economies, and ultimately fail to ever force the target government to change its policy?
The logic strongly suggests that unless a massive cyber attack or a sanctions regime achieves actual denial, unless it specifically thwarts the target state's physical ability to execute its strategy or fund its military apparatus, it is highly likely to fail just as predictably and cause just as much pointless civilian hardship as the blockades and bombing campaigns of the past.
Which means we might be standing in the exact same strategic trap, simply holding different weapons. We want to believe that there's a clean, logical solution. We want to believe that if we just apply the right amount of pressure, the enemy will inevitably break.
But they don't.
The muddy waters of human conflict, the fierce power of nationalism, and the incredible resilience of states keep proving our assumptions wrong. The system simply doesn't break the way we expect it to. It is something to seriously think about the next time you read the news about an escalating conflict or new round of sanctions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.